The Dalton gang kicked open the church doors, just as Reverend Joshua Black was reading from Matthew 5:44. "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." The preacher's voice carried clearly through the packed Sunday morning service in Redemption, Kansas. 43 parishioners sat in the wooden pews, including families with young children, elderly couples who had attended every service for 15 years, and newcomers still finding their faith. What none of them knew was that the 6 armed men now standing in the doorway had come to test everything. Reverend Black claimed to believe about forgiveness, mercy, and the power of turning the other cheek. Because Bob Dalton had heard stories about the peaceful preacher who had built 12 churches across Kansas without ever carrying a gun, and he wanted to see if a man of God would abandon his principles when innocent lives hung in the balance. But to understand why this moment would become the ultimate test of faith versus survival, you need to know about the choice Joshua Black made 10 years earlier when he traded his gun belt for a Bible and promised God he would never take another life. Because this story begins not in a church, but in a saloon in Dodge City where the man who would become Reverend Black was known by a very different name. A name that struck fear into the hearts of gunfighters across 3 territories. It was March 15, 1871, when Joshua Black Jack Thorne walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon in Dodge City, Kansas, his hand resting on the pearl-handled Colt .45 that had made him the most feared gunfighter west of the Mississippi. At 28 years old, Black Jack had killed 17 men in fair fights, each one documented by witnesses and reported in newspapers that followed his exploits with morbid fascination. He was fast, accurate, and absolutely ruthless when provoked. But more than that, he was tired. The gunfight that night in Dodge City started like so many others. A young hothead named Billy Morrison had been drinking heavily and bragging to anyone who would listen that he was fast enough to take down the famous Black Jack Thorne. Morrison was barely 20, with the kind of reckless confidence that got young men killed on the frontier. He had been calling Black Jack out for hours, growing more belligerent with each drink. Black Jack had tried to ignore the provocations, nursing his whiskey in a corner booth and hoping the kid would pass out before doing something stupid. But Morrison wouldn't let it go. Finally, he stood up in the middle of the crowded saloon and issued a formal challenge. "Black Jack Thorne," Morrison shouted, his voice slurring with alcohol. "They say you're the fastest gun in Kansas. I say you're nothing but a tired old man trading on his reputation. Face me like a man or admit you're a coward." The saloon went dead quiet. Every eye turned to Black Jack, who sat motionless for a long moment before slowly standing up. He had faced this scenario dozens of times before, and it always ended the same way. Some young fool thought killing Black Jack Thorne would make him famous, and Black Jack would be forced to defend himself. Another grave would be dug, another family would mourn, and the legend would grow a little larger. But as Black Jack walked toward the swinging doors that led to the street, something happened that had never happened before. A small voice called out from the crowd, "Please don't hurt my daddy." Black Jack stopped and turned to see a little girl, maybe 6 years old, standing beside a table where a woman sat with tears streaming down her face. The woman was trying to quiet the child, but the girl broke free and ran toward Morrison. "Daddy, please don't do this," the little girl pleaded, grabbing onto Morrison's legs. "Come home with us. Mama's scared." For the first time in his career as a gunfighter, Black Jack Thorne found himself looking at the family of the man he was about to kill. He saw the terror in the woman's eyes, the confusion in the child's face, the way Morrison's bravado crumbled when confronted with the reality of what he was risking. And for the first time, Black Jack wondered if there might be another way to handle this situation. "Morrison," Black Jack said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent saloon. "You've got a beautiful family. Don't throw your life away for the sake of a reputation that won't mean anything when you're dead." But Morrison was too drunk and too committed to back down now. He pushed his daughter aside and stepped into the street, his hand hovering over his gun. Black Jack followed, knowing that this confrontation would end like all the others, but hoping against hope that the young father would come to his senses. The gunfight lasted less than 3 seconds. Morrison's draw was clumsy and slow, his alcohol-impaired reflexes no match for Black Jack's practiced speed. Morrison's bullet went wide, embedding itself in a wooden post. Black Jack's shot was true, striking Morrison in the chest and dropping him in the dusty street. As Morrison lay dying, his wife and daughter ran to his side. The little girl's cries echoed through the night air, a sound that would haunt Black Jack for the rest of his life. "Daddy, wake up, please wake up." The woman held her husband's head in her lap, whispering prayers and promises, but it was too late. Billy Morrison died in that street, leaving behind a widow and an orphan, all for the sake of proving something to strangers in a saloon. Black Jack holstered his gun and walked away from the scene, but something fundamental had changed inside him. For the first time in his career as a gunfighter, he had seen the full cost of violence. It wasn't just about two men settling a dispute anymore. It was about children who would grow up without fathers, wives who would struggle to survive alone, and communities torn apart by senseless death. That night, Black Jack sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the pearl-handled Colt that had made him famous. He thought about all the men he had killed, all the families he had destroyed, all the grief he had caused in the name of self-defense and reputation. For the first time, he wondered if there might be a different way to live. The answer came to him 3 days later when he attended Billy Morrison's funeral. The service was held at the small Methodist church on the edge of town, and Black Jack stood in the back, hat in hand, listening to the preacher talk about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of new beginnings. When the preacher spoke about how even the worst sinner could find salvation through faith and good works, something stirred in Black Jack's heart. After the service, Black Jack approached the preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Samuel Miller, who had ministered to the frontier communities of Kansas for over 30 years. Black Jack expected judgment, condemnation, maybe even a demand that he leave town. Instead, Reverend Miller listened quietly, as Black Jack confessed his sins and his desire to find a new path. "Son," Reverend Miller said after Black Jack had finished speaking, "the Lord doesn't care what you've done in the past. He only cares what you're willing to do in the future. If you truly want to change your life, if you're willing to dedicate yourself to helping others instead of hurting them, then there's a place for you in God's kingdom." That conversation changed everything. Black Jack Thorne spent the next 6 months studying with Reverend Miller, learning scripture, theology, and the principles of peaceful conflict resolution. He discovered that he had a gift for preaching, an ability to connect with people who had lost their way, just as he had lost his. When Reverend Miller died peacefully in his sleep that winter, Black Jack felt called to carry on his mentor's work. Joshua Black buried his guns, adopted his middle name as his identity, and began his new life as a minister. His first assignment was a small congregation in western Kansas, a community of farmers and ranchers who desperately needed spiritual guidance. Black Jack Thorne's reputation preceded him, but Reverend Joshua Black earned respect through his actions, not his gun. Over the next 10 years, Joshua built 11 more churches across Kansas, traveling from community to community, preaching the gospel, and helping settlers build not just houses of worship but foundations for civilized society. He officiated at weddings, baptisms, and funerals. He mediated disputes between neighbors, provided counseling to troubled families, and served as a voice of reason in communities where violence was often the first solution to any problem. Joshua's transformation was complete and genuine. He never carried a weapon, never responded to provocation with threats or violence, and consistently demonstrated the Christian principles he preached. Many people knew about his past as Black Jack Thorne, but they also saw the man he had become. His reputation as a peacemaker grew throughout Kansas, and his churches became symbols of hope and stability in frontier communities. But on that Sunday morning in March 1881, all of Joshua's principles would be put to the ultimate test when Bob Dalton and his gang decided to make an example of the famous peaceful preacher. The Dalton gang had been terrorizing Kansas for months, robbing banks, trains, and stores with increasing boldness. Bob Dalton, the leader, was a smart and ruthless criminal who understood that his gang's success depended on maintaining an atmosphere of fear. People who were too scared to resist were easier to rob, and communities that felt helpless were less likely to organize effective opposition. But Bob had heard troubling reports about towns where Reverend Joshua Black had established churches. These communities seemed more organized, more willing to stand together against outside threats. The preacher's message of courage, faith, and mutual support was undermining the very fear that made the Dalton gang's work possible. Bob decided that Joshua Black needed to be discredited, shown to be a hypocrite who would abandon his principles when faced with real danger. If Bob could force the famous peaceful preacher to resort to violence, it would shatter the faith of every community where Joshua had built a church. It would prove that Christian principles were worthless when lives were at stake. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Bob and his 5 men would take an entire congregation hostage during Sunday service, then force Joshua to choose between his principles and the lives of innocent people. Either the preacher would fight, proving himself a hypocrite, or he would watch helplessly as the outlaws killed his parishioners one by one. When the gang burst through the church doors that Sunday morning, Joshua was reading from the Sermon on the Mount, the very passage that had first inspired him to change his life. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a man preaching about loving your enemies, suddenly confronted by enemies who had come to destroy everything he had built. "Well, well," Bob Dalton said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church. "If it isn't the famous Reverend Joshua Black, though I hear some folks remember you by a different name." Joshua set down his Bible carefully and stepped forward, placing himself between the outlaws and his congregation. "Gentlemen, this is a house of worship. If you have business with me, we can discuss it outside." Bob laughed and drew his gun, pointing it at an elderly woman in the front row. "Our business is right here, preacher. You see, we've heard all about your peaceful ways, your Christian charity, your belief in turning the other cheek. We're here to see how far that faith really goes. What do you want?" Joshua asked quietly. "Simple," Bob replied. "We want you to renounce your faith. Stand up there in your pulpit and tell these good people that everything you've been preaching is a lie. Tell them that when real danger comes, God won't protect them, prayer won't save them, and the only thing that matters is who's willing to pull a trigger first." The church was dead silent except for the quiet sobbing of children who sensed the danger without understanding it fully. Joshua looked out at his congregation, people who had trusted him, families who had built their lives around the principles he had taught them. Men like Frank Morrison, a farmer whose faith had helped him overcome his drinking problem. Women like Sarah Edwards, whose husband had died in a mining accident, and who found comfort in Joshua's promise that death was not the end. Children who had been baptized in the creek behind the church, and who believed with absolute certainty that good would triumph over evil because Reverend Black had told them so. "I can't do that," Joshua said simply. "Because it wouldn't be true." Bob's expression hardened. "Then I guess we'll have to find another way to make our point." He gestured to one of his men, who grabbed 8-year-old Tommy Patterson and pressed a knife to the boy's throat. "How about this, preacher? Renounce your faith, or we start killing your flock one by one, starting with the children." Tommy's mother screamed and started to rise from her pew, but another outlaw pushed her back down. The boy was crying now, calling for his mama, and Joshua felt something break inside his chest. This was exactly the situation he had dreaded for 10 years, the moment when his commitment to peace would be tested against the lives of innocent people. "Please," Joshua said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Let the child go. If you want to make a point, make it with me. These people have done nothing to you." "Oh, but they have," Bob replied. "They've chosen to follow a coward who hides behind a Bible instead of standing up for what's right. They've chosen to believe in fairy tales instead of facing reality, and that makes them weak, preacher. Weak people get hurt in this world." Joshua looked around the church, seeing the faces of people he had come to love like family. Frank Morrison, who had stopped drinking and started reading the Bible to his children every night. Sarah Edwards, who had found the strength to rebuild her life after tragedy. The Patterson family, whose son was now in mortal danger because of his association with a preacher who claimed to serve a loving God. For a moment, Joshua's hand moved instinctively toward his hip, where his gun belt used to hang. The muscle memory was still there, the reflexes that had made Black Jack Thorne the fastest draw in 3 territories. He could visualize the entire sequence, diving behind the pulpit for cover, drawing and firing, eliminating the immediate threat to Tommy. Then working his way through the rest of the gang. His old skills were still there, buried but not forgotten. But then Joshua remembered why he had given up that life. He remembered Billy Morrison dying in the street while his daughter cried for her daddy. He remembered the promise he had made to God and to himself that he would never again be the cause of a family's grief. Violence might save these people today, but it would destroy everything he had built, everything he believed in, everything he had become. "Mr. Dalton," Joshua said quietly, "you're right about one thing. I used to be someone else, someone who solved problems with a gun. I was very good at it, and I was very wrong to do it. I've spent the last 10 years trying to prove that there's a better way, that people can live together without violence, that faith and love are stronger than fear and hatred." "Pretty words, preacher," Bob sneered. "But words won't save this boy's life." "You're right," Joshua agreed. "Only action will save him, and I'm prepared to act." Joshua stepped forward, his hands raised but empty. "Take me instead. I'm the one you really want. Let these people go and I'll do whatever you ask." Bob considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "Nice try, but that's not how this works. See, if I just kill you, then you become a martyr. Your people will remember you as a saint who died for his beliefs. But if I force you to abandon those beliefs, if I make you choose violence over faith, then you become just another hypocrite. And all these churches you've built will crumble because people will know that even you didn't really believe what you were preaching." Joshua realized that Bob Dalton was more intelligent and more dangerous than he had initially thought. This wasn't just about robbery or random violence. This was a calculated attack on the very foundation of faith and hope that Joshua had spent a decade building. "There's something you should know," Joshua said calmly. "About the man I used to be." "Oh, we know all about Black Jack Thorne," Bob replied. "Fastest gun in Kansas, 17 confirmed kills, feared from here to Texas. But that was a long time ago, preacher. You've gone soft, you've forgotten how to fight." Joshua shook his head slowly. "I haven't forgotten anything. Every skill I ever had is still here. I could probably outdraw all 6 of you before you could blink. But I won't. Not because I can't, but because I choose not to. That's what real strength looks like, Mr. Dalton. The strength to choose peace when violence would be easier." For the first time, Bob looked uncertain. He had expected either cowardice or hypocrisy from the preacher, but this quiet confidence was something he hadn't anticipated. "You're bluffing," Bob said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Am I?" Joshua asked. "Tell me, Mr. Dalton, what do you think would happen if I picked up a gun right now? How many of your men would survive the next 60 seconds? How many families would be mourning their sons and brothers tomorrow? How many more children would grow up without fathers because of choices made in anger and fear?" Joshua paused, letting his words sink in. "I could end this confrontation right now with violence. I could probably save most of these people by killing all of you. But then what? What would I tell Tommy Patterson about why his Sunday school teacher has blood on his hands? What would I tell Sarah Edwards about how a man of God chose to solve problems the same way as every other outlaw and killer on the frontier?" Bob was clearly struggling now, his plan falling apart as Joshua refused to play by the expected rules. The preacher wasn't cowering or threatening or pleading. He was simply explaining, with quiet certainty, why he wouldn't fight back even to save innocent lives. "You're crazy," Bob said finally. "You'd rather watch innocent people die than pick up a gun." "I'd rather find a third option," Joshua replied. "The same option I try to teach everyone who will listen. Instead of choosing between violence and surrender, instead of accepting that conflict can only end in death, what if we chose understanding? What if we tried to solve the real problem instead of just fighting over the symptoms? There is no real problem, Bob snapped. This is just business. No, Joshua said gently. This isn't about money or robbery or even reputation. This is about fear. You're afraid that if people stop being scared, if they start working together and taking care of each other, then men like you won't have any power anymore. You're afraid that communities built on faith and mutual support will be stronger than gangs built on intimidation and violence. Bob's hand tightened on his gun, and for a moment it seemed like he might simply shoot Joshua and end the conversation. But something in the preacher's calm certainty made him hesitate. And you know what? Joshua continued. You're absolutely right to be afraid. Because that's exactly what's happening. Every church I've built, every community that's come together around shared values instead of shared fears, every family that's chosen love over hatred, all of that makes your way of life a little bit more obsolete. The church was completely silent now, everyone hanging on every word of this extraordinary conversation between a man of God and a man of violence. Even the outlaws seemed mesmerized by Joshua's calm eloquence. So here's what I propose, Joshua said. Let these people go, and I'll come with you. Not as a hostage, but as someone willing to show you that there really is a better way to live. You can rob every bank in Kansas, but you'll never find enough money to fill the emptiness that drives you to hurt innocent people. But if you're willing to try something different, if you're willing to consider that maybe strength comes from building things up instead of tearing them down, then I'm willing to help you find that path. Bob stared at Joshua for a long moment, clearly torn between anger, confusion, and something that might have been hope. His men were looking to him for guidance, but Bob seemed as uncertain as they were. You're serious, Bob said finally. You really believe all that? With every fiber of my being, Joshua replied. That's when everything went wrong. While Bob was focused on Joshua's words, he had forgotten about the knife at Tommy Patterson's throat. The outlaw holding the boy was getting nervous, his hand trembling as the tension in the room built to an unbearable level. When Tommy tried to squirm away from the blade, the outlaw's grip tightened reflexively. The knife bit into Tommy's neck, drawing blood and a sharp cry of pain from the child. His mother screamed, the congregation gasped, and Bob Dalton's moment of uncertainty vanished as the situation spiraled toward violence. That's enough talking, Bob snarled, his gun now pointed directly at Joshua's chest. You've got 10 seconds to renounce your faith and admit that everything you've been preaching is worthless, or the boy dies, and we start working our way through the rest of your flock. Joshua looked at Tommy, blood trickling down his neck, his 8-year-old eyes wide with terror and confusion. He looked at the boy's mother, sobbing and reaching desperately toward her son. He looked at his congregation, 43 people who had trusted him to guide them toward salvation, and who now faced death because of that trust. And then Joshua Black made a choice that would define not only the rest of his life, but the legacy of everything he had built over the past 10 years. Mr. Dalton, Joshua said quietly, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am going to ask you one more time to let these people go. I'm going to offer you one more chance to choose a different path, and then if you refuse, I'm going to show you why they used to call me Black Jack Thorne. The change in Joshua's voice was subtle but unmistakable. The gentle warmth was still there, but underneath it was something cold and deadly, something that had been dormant for a decade, but had never really gone away. Bob Dalton had heard that tone before, in the voices of men who were absolutely certain they could kill him if necessary. You're bluffing, Bob said, but his voice was shaking now. There's a gun in the pulpit, Joshua said, matter-of-factly, hidden in a compartment I built 10 years ago and hoped I'd never have to use. It's loaded, clean, and perfectly maintained. If I move toward that pulpit, you'll have maybe 3 seconds to kill me before I reach it. If I reach it, you and your men will be dead before you can hurt anyone else in this room. Bob's eyes flicked toward the pulpit, trying to calculate distances and angles. His men were getting nervous, sensing that the situation was about to explode into violence. But here's what I want you to understand, Joshua continued. If I pick up that gun, if I become Black Jack Thorne again even for 60 seconds, then everything I've built for the past 10 years dies with you. Every person in this room will go home today knowing that when the test came, their preacher chose violence over faith. Every community where I've built a church will wonder if their minister is really just another killer with a Bible. The man I've become, the life I've built, the good I've tried to do, all of it will be destroyed the moment I pull that trigger." Joshua paused, his eyes locked on Bob's. "So I'm asking you one final time. Is this really how you want this to end? With a gunfight in a church, children watching their Sunday school teacher become a killer, families torn apart by violence that could have been avoided? Or are you willing to consider that maybe, just maybe, there's enough good left in you to choose a different path?" The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Bob Dalton stood frozen, his gun aimed at Joshua's chest, his face a mask of indecision and growing fear. His men waited for orders that didn't come. The congregation held its collective breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether they lived or died. And then, incredibly, Bob Dalton lowered his gun. "Let the boy go," he said quietly to his man. "All of you, put your weapons down." "Boss," one of the outlaws asked, confused. "I said put them down," Bob snapped. "We're leaving." As Tommy Patterson ran crying into his mother's arms, Bob looked one last time at Joshua Black. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the biggest fool. I can't decide which." "Maybe both," Joshua replied. "But I'd rather be a live fool than a dead hero." Bob nodded slowly, then gestured for his men to head for the door. As they prepared to leave, he turned back to Joshua. "For what it's worth, preacher, you were right about one thing. This isn't about money or business. It's about being afraid that everything you've built your life on is wrong. And today, you scared me more than any gunfighter ever has." After the outlaws had ridden away, the congregation sat in stunned silence for several minutes before erupting in questions, tears, and prayers of thanksgiving. But Joshua barely heard any of it. He was focused on one terrible truth: he had been willing to kill again. When pushed to the ultimate test, when faced with the choice between his principles and the lives of innocent people, he had been prepared to abandon everything he claimed to believe. That night, Joshua sat alone in his small cabin behind the church, staring at the hidden gun he had never had to draw. He had saved his congregation without firing a shot, had proven that faith and courage could triumph over violence and fear. But he had also learned that Black Jack Thorne was still there, buried beneath a decade of sermons and good works, ready to emerge when the stakes were high enough. The next Sunday, Joshua stood before his congregation and delivered the most honest sermon of his career. He talked about the struggle between good and evil that exists in every human heart, about the constant choice between love and hatred, between building up and tearing down. He admitted that he was not a perfect man, that he carried within himself the capacity for both great good and terrible violence. But most importantly, he talked about the grace that allows imperfect people to choose to be better than they are, to strive for ideals they may never fully achieve, to build something beautiful and lasting even when they know they may fail. He reminded his congregation that faith is not about being perfect, but about choosing to believe in something larger than yourself and working every day to live up to that belief. The Dalton gang never returned to Redemption, Kansas. Bob Dalton was killed 3 years later in a shootout during a bank robbery in Coffeyville, Kansas. Before he died, witnesses reported that he spoke about a preacher who had shown him that there were different ways to be strong, different ways to matter. Whether those words represented genuine conversion or simple regret, no one could say. Joshua Black continued his ministry for another 20 years, eventually building 18 churches across Kansas and Nebraska. He never again faced a situation as dire as that Sunday morning in 1881, but he carried the memory of it with him always, a reminder that the choice between good and evil is never final, never easy, and never guaranteed. The hidden gun remained in the pulpit at Redemption for the rest of Joshua's life, a symbol of both his human frailty and his divine calling. He never drew it, never even touched it again, but knowing it was there served as a constant reminder that strength comes not from the absence of temptation, but from the choice to resist it. When Joshua died peacefully in 1901, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his ministry. Among the mourners was a man who gave his name only as Robert, an aging cowboy who spoke quietly about how a preacher's courage had once shown him that real strength comes from choosing mercy over vengeance, understanding over hatred, hope over fear. The church at Redemption still stands today, a testament to the idea that even flawed human beings can choose to build something lasting and beautiful. Above the pulpit, a simple wooden plaque bears the words that Joshua Black lived by for 30 years. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. But perhaps the most important lesson of Joshua Black's story isn't about the choice he made that Sunday morning in 1881. It's about the recognition that being good doesn't mean being perfect, that having the capacity for violence doesn't make you evil, and that the measure of a person's character isn't found in their moments of strength, but in their decision to choose love when hatred would be easier, hope when despair would be justified, and faith when fear would be more reasonable. Joshua Black proved that it's possible to change, possible to become better than you were, possible to build a life of meaning and purpose, even when you've made terrible mistakes. His story reminds us that redemption is always possible, that it's never too late to choose a different path, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in fighting but in refusing to fight, not in winning but in choosing not to play the game at all. The man who had once been the fastest gun in Kansas became something far more dangerous, a living example that there really is a better way to live, that love really is stronger than hatred, and that faith really can move mountains, even when those mountains are made of fear, anger, and the human capacity for violence. In the end, that may be the most subversive and revolutionary message of all, that ordinary people can choose to be extraordinary, that broken lives can be rebuilt, and that the same hands that once dealt death can learn to nurture life. Joshua Black's legacy lives on not in the number of men he killed as Black Jack Thorne, but in the number of communities he helped build as Reverend Joshua Black, and in the enduring proof that it's never too late to choose redemption over revenge, hope over hatred, and love over everything else that would tear us apart.